Hey guys, tonight we begin with a city that decided sunlight was overrated. Ventilation shafts, stone doors, livestock, churches, all carved beneath what looked like a completely normal town. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In 1963, a man in the quiet Anatolian town of Derinkuyu decided to renovate his basement. Now usually, when you knock down a wall in your basement, you find one of three things: dust, spiders, or regret. What you do not expect to find is a lost civilization. But that's exactly what happened. He swung his hammer, the wall gave way, and instead of solid rock, there was empty space. A hidden room. Already unusual. Most people would stop there, seal it back up, and pretend they didn't see anything. Not this guy. He noticed a narrow passage leading deeper into the darkness, and instead of thinking, "This is how horror movies begin," he stepped inside. The passage sloped downward. It didn't end, it just kept going. Soon it opened into another chamber, then another corridor, then stairways carved directly into the rock, spiraling deeper beneath the town. The walls weren't jagged or natural. They were smooth in places, shaped, intentional. This was not a cave. This was architecture, and not the "I built a wine cellar" kind. The "we might need to disappear for several months because an army is coming" kind. Archaeologists would later confirm that what he had stumbled upon was an enormous underground city, stretching roughly 60 meters below ground, with as many as 18 levels, rooms for families, communal kitchens, storage chambers, wells, churches, ventilation shafts. It could shelter up to 20,000 people. 20,000. That's not a hideout. That's a fully operational subterranean suburb. Imagine discovering that your basement leads to a town larger than your town. For centuries, people lived their lives above this place without realizing what was below them. Children ran through streets directly over ancient corridors. Farmers ploughed fields above forgotten chapels. Entire generations slept peacefully while an underground city waited beneath their foundations. And the craziest part? It wasn't uncovered by some dramatic archaeological expedition with banners and press conferences. It was found because someone wanted more storage space. History didn't roar back to life. It politely cleared its throat behind a basement wall. And sometimes that's how the past works. Empires collapse loudly. Wars are remembered. But the truly unsettling things, they just sit quietly underground, waiting for a man with a hammer and mild curiosity. Now that we've established that one random basement renovation uncovered a hidden metropolis, the obvious question is this: who wakes up one day and decides, "You know what this town needs? 17 more floors? Downward?" Derinkuyu wasn't dug all at once. It evolved over centuries. The region of Cappadocia sits on soft volcanic rock called tuff, easy enough to carve with simple tools, yet stable enough to hold large chambers without collapsing. In other words, it was the perfect material for anyone thinking, "Let's build a secret underground civilization just in case." The earliest tunnels may date back to the Phrygians around the 8th century BCE. Later, Byzantine Christians expanded the complex dramatically. Every generation added something: a room here, a corridor there, another level when paranoia increased. And paranoia definitely increased. By the time Derinkuyu reached its full scale, it descended about 60 meters underground. That's roughly the height of a 20-story building. Except instead of going up towards sunlight and views, they went down into cool, dimly lit stone corridors. There were narrow staircases connecting levels, designed intentionally tight. Not because they were minimalists, because if invaders somehow broke in, you didn't want them sprinting comfortably through your underground neighborhood. Some corridors are so small you have to duck, which makes you realize something important. This was not designed for tourism. It was designed for survival. Entire sections were carefully planned. Storage rooms for grain and dried food, presses for wine and oil, communal kitchens, even designated spaces for animals. Because if you're hiding for months, you're bringing the goats. Ventilation shafts ran vertically through multiple levels, allowing fresh air to circulate. One central shaft alone served both as air supply and water access. That's not random digging, that's engineering. And what makes it even more impressive is this. There were no cranes, no power drills, no industrial lighting, just hand tools, persistence, and a very strong desire not to be conquered. Derinkuyu wasn't chaotic tunneling. It was urban planning, underground urban planning. Instead of expanding outward like every other civilization, they expanded inward, layer by layer, fear by fear, carving safety into the earth itself. Because when your world feels unstable, sometimes the only direction that feels safe is down. So why go through all this trouble? Because people do not casually carve 18 underground levels for fun weekend projects. This wasn't a quirky architectural trend. It was a response to danger. Central Anatolia sat at the crossroads of empires. Armies passed through constantly. Hittites, Persians, Romans, Arabs, Byzantines. If there was a map, someone wanted control of it. And when empires argue, civilians tend to suffer. Derinkuyu became a refuge. During periods of invasion, especially during the Arab-Byzantine conflicts between the 7th and 10th centuries, entire communities could vanish underground. And not metaphorically vanish, physically disappear. Picture this. An army approaches. Dust clouds on the horizon. Word spreads quickly. Instead of panicking in the streets, families move with purpose. Supplies are carried below. Animals are guided inside. Massive stone doors are rolled into place. And then the town above goes quiet. No smoke from chimneys, no movement, no resistance. Just emptiness. Imagine being part of the invading force, walking into what should be a populated settlement, only to find it abandoned. No bodies, no fleeing crowds, just houses standing silently. Meanwhile, beneath your boots, thousands of people are breathing softly in stone chambers. It's both brilliant and slightly unsettling. The underground city wasn't meant for permanent living. It was a temporary sanctuary, a place to outlast the threat. Residents could stay below for weeks, even months if necessary. They had water, ventilation, food storage, and livestock. Everything needed to wait out violence, and waiting was often smarter than fighting, because fighting requires weapons and soldiers. Hiding requires engineering and patience. There's something deeply human about Derinkuyu. Instead of building taller walls or larger armies, they built a backup plan, a quiet one. They didn't try to conquer the world, they tried to survive it. And survival doesn't always look heroic. Sometimes it looks like narrow tunnels, shared air, and whispered conversations in dim light, while hoping the noise above eventually fades. When the surface became unpredictable, the earth became protection. Not glamorous, not glorious, but effective. And sometimes that's enough. Now, hiding underground is one thing. But what happens if someone finds your entrance? That's where Derinkuyu gets beautifully paranoid. Throughout the city, especially at key choke points, builders installed massive circular stone doors. Not decorative, not symbolic, functional. Each one was carved from solid stone, shaped like a giant wheel, sometimes weighing several hundred kilograms. They were positioned in narrow corridors and could be rolled into place from the inside. From the outside, good luck. These doors had a small hole in the centre, likely used to push or pull them into position with a wooden beam. Once sealed, they blocked the passage completely. And because the corridors were intentionally tight, there wasn't much room to build momentum or break through. Imagine invading a tunnel system and suddenly being face to face with a 3-foot thick stone disc that says, politely but firmly, no. And here's the clever part. The doors could only be fully operated from the inside. Even if attackers managed to force entry into upper levels, residents could retreat deeper, and seal off sections behind them. Layered defense. Think medieval submarine logic. The city wasn't one open space. It was compartmentalized. Sections could be isolated if necessary. If one level was breached, others remained secure. This tells us something important about the mindset of its builders. They weren't naive. They assumed that at some point, someone would try to get in. Derinkuyu wasn't built with optimism. It was built with contingency planning. And honestly, that level of preparedness feels oddly modern. We install alarms and security systems. They installed half-ton rolling stone barriers. Same energy. The placement of these doors also reveals strategic thinking. They were positioned at intersections and stairways, natural bottlenecks. You don't defend every square meter. You defend the choke points. Military logic carved into rock. And just imagine the moment those doors were rolled shut. The sound alone must have echoed through the tunnels, stone grinding against stone. A final, heavy signal that the outside world was no longer welcome. Above ground, armies searched for life. Below ground, entire communities listened, waiting, silent, behind a door that weighed more than your average horse. If that doesn't say, "We are not coming out until you leave," nothing does. Now here's the part where Derinkuyu stops being impressive and starts being genius. Because hiding 20,000 people underground is one thing, keeping them alive down there is another. Let's start with air. Derinkuyu contains more than 50 ventilation shafts, some plunging from the deepest levels all the way to the surface. These weren't accidental holes. They were carefully engineered vertical channels that allowed fresh air to circulate naturally through the city. No electricity, no mechanical fans, just physics. Warm air rises, cool air sinks. The builders understood this well enough to create a passive airflow system that kept oxygen moving through multiple levels. Even at 60 meters underground, people could breathe comfortably, which is kind of important. One central shaft alone served as a primary ventilation column and possibly a water well. It connected numerous floors, distributing air throughout the complex like a stone lung. And speaking of water, they thought of that too. Some wells were dug from inside the city but did not connect directly to the surface. This is crucial. If invaders discovered a surface well, they couldn't poison the underground water supply. That's not just survival thinking, that's next-level caution. It shows that the builders anticipated siege conditions. They expected enemies who might try to contaminate water sources. So they created protected internal wells, accessible only from below. You could seal the city and still drink safely. Which means Derinkuyu wasn't designed for hiding overnight. It was designed for endurance. Food storage rooms were placed strategically. Grain, dried fruits, preserved foods, supplies that could last for extended periods. Oil presses and wine presses suggest that even during tense times, people tried to maintain some sense of normal life. Because if you're going to live underground for months, you might as well have bread and wine. The engineering reveals something deeply human. Fear, yes, but also planning. Intelligence. Cooperation. This was not chaotic digging by desperate individuals. It was organized effort. Air circulation, secure water, stored food, all functioning together as a self-contained survival system. Derinkuyu wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a carefully designed backup world. A world built on one simple assumption. The surface cannot always be trusted. So let's build somewhere that can. At this point you might be imagining Derinkuyu as a network of dark, cramped tunnels where everyone sat in silence waiting for danger to pass. But that's not quite accurate. This wasn't just survival mode. This was underground suburbia. The city was organized into functional zones. There were living quarters for families, communal kitchens for food preparation, storage rooms for grain and supplies, and designated areas for livestock. The layout wasn't random. It reflected a structured society that understood the importance of order, especially in confined spaces. Because if you're sealing 20,000 people underground, chaos is not an option. Rooms were carved with niches for storage, flat surfaces for sleeping, and areas for daily tasks. Some chambers were surprisingly spacious, Not luxurious, but practical. Enough room to function without constantly bumping into your neighbour, which, given the circumstances, was probably considered premium real estate. There were also communal gathering areas. Life underground wasn't just about hiding, it was about maintaining routine, cooking meals, caring for children, managing animals, storing food, even educating the young. Yes, there were spaces believed to function as schools. Imagine being a child down there. Why don't we play outside? Because an army might be outside. Reasonable answer. The upper levels were often used for animals. Livestock produced heat and required ventilation, so placing them closer to air shafts made practical sense. It also kept deeper levels cleaner for human habitation. Smart zoning. And then there were the kitchens. Blackened ceilings show evidence of cooking fires, carefully managed so smoke could escape through ventilation systems without giving away the city's presence. Because nothing ruins a secret underground civilization like visible smoke signals. What stands out most is how normal life tried to remain normal. People still ate together, prayed together, raised children, preserved food, shared stories. The earth above might have been uncertain, but below ground there was structure. Routine creates stability, even underground. Derinkuyu wasn't just a bunker for emergencies. It was a temporary extension of the surface world, carved into stone, built with intention, and organized with the understanding that survival isn't only about staying alive, it's about keeping society intact while you do. Now here's something that makes Derinkuyu feel less like a bunker and more like a hidden civilization. They didn't just bring food and goats underground, they brought their faith. Deep within the city, archaeologists discovered chapels and religious spaces carved directly into the rock. Some chambers feature vaulted ceilings and apses typical of Byzantine church architecture. This wasn't an afterthought. It was planned, which tells you something important. When people prepared to hide from invading armies, they made sure prayer rooms were included in the blueprint. That's priorities. Many of the major expansions of Derinkuyu are believed to have occurred during the Byzantine era, when Christian communities in the region faced periodic threats. Religious persecution and military invasions were real dangers. Retreating underground wasn't just about avoiding violence. It was about preserving belief systems. Faith travels with you, even 60 meters below ground. Imagine gathering in a stone-carved chapel lit only by oil lamps, the air cool, the walls absorbing whispers. Above you, uncertainty. Below you, silence. And in that stillness, hymns echoing softly through corridors. It must have been surreal. There's something powerful about the idea that in the middle of fear, people still chose to carve out spaces for reflection and worship. They didn't reduce life to pure survival mechanics. They kept their identity intact. Because when everything else feels unstable, belief becomes an anchor. And from a psychological standpoint, that matters. Living underground for extended periods would have been mentally taxing. No sky, limited light, tight spaces. But ritual provides structure. Routine gives comfort. Shared prayer builds solidarity. It reminds people why they're enduring hardship in the first place. It's also worth noting that some underground churches in Cappadocia feature simple carvings and symbols, not extravagant decoration. Function over flair. You don't need stained glass when your ceiling is volcanic stone. What Derinkuyu reveals here is subtle, but profound. Survival is not just physical, it's cultural, it's spiritual, it's communal. They didn't descend into the earth to become shadows. They descended to protect who they were. And sometimes, preserving identity is the most defiant act of all, even in the dark. Now let's talk about something we rarely think about when admiring ancient engineering. What does it do to your mind to live underground? Because ventilation and water systems are impressive, yes, but humans are not moles. We are not designed for months without sunlight. Derinkuyu may have been a masterpiece of survival planning, but psychologically, it must have been intense. Imagine descending into the city as word spreads that an army is approaching. You gather your children, you bring supplies. You move quickly but quietly. The stone door rolls shut behind you with a heavy grind, and then the outside world disappears. No horizon, no wind, no open sky. Just rock walls and narrow corridors, illuminated by flickering oil lamps. Light would have been limited and precious. Every flame carefully managed to avoid smoke build-up. Shadows would stretch along walls, shifting with every movement. Sound would travel strangely through the tunnels. Footsteps echoing, voices amplified in unexpected ways. Privacy? Minimal. If someone coughed 3 corridors away, you probably heard it. Yet humans adapt. They always do. Routine becomes your anchor. Meals at regular times, communal gatherings, prayer, tasks to complete, animals to feed, children to supervise. Structure keeps panic from spreading. Still, the waiting must have been the hardest part. Waiting to know if the invaders had passed. Waiting to know if your home above still stood. Waiting in the dark, hoping silence meant safety. There's something uniquely stressful about not knowing what's happening above you. Every distant vibration might be footsteps. Every faint sound could mean discovery. And yet, generation after generation chose this method, which suggests that whatever horrors existed above ground were worse than claustrophobia below it. The underground city was not meant to be permanent. It was a temporary world, a suspended reality, a place to outlast chaos. Eventually, someone would climb toward the surface, carefully, slowly, listening. If the air felt safe, if the sky was quiet, then the community would rise again, blinking in the sunlight. And that contrast must have been overwhelming. From stone darkness to open sky, from silence to birdsong. Derinkuyu wasn't just a physical refuge. It was an emotional gamble. A place where fear and hope coexisted, 60 meters beneath the earth. If Derinkuyu were the only underground city in the region, it would already be extraordinary. But it wasn't alone. Cappadocia is riddled with similar subterranean complexes. Kaimakli, Oskonak, Marzi, and dozens more. Some are smaller, some are partially collapsed. But together, they reveal something even more impressive than a single hidden refuge. This was a system. Derinkuyu itself may have been connected to other underground cities through long tunnels stretching for kilometers. One such passage reportedly links it to Kaimakli, several kilometers away. Imagine that. Not only did people build a massive underground city, they built underground highways between them, because apparently, once you commit to living beneath the earth, you really commit. This suggests coordination between communities. Shared strategies, shared threats, a regional understanding that if danger comes, we all go down. It also tells us that Derinkuyu wasn't some isolated act of desperation. It was cultural knowledge. People knew how to carve these spaces. They passed the skill down. They improved designs over generations. They standardized ventilation systems, defense mechanisms, storage areas. This wasn't random tunneling. It was architectural tradition. And the more archaeologists study these sites, the clearer it becomes that underground living was not an occasional last resort. It was an expected contingency. If you lived in Cappadocia, you didn't just build a house. You built a house with an escape plan. It changes how you see the surface town above. What looks like a peaceful rural landscape hides layers of engineering below. Entire neighborhoods had access points. Entrances were concealed inside homes, courtyards, or narrow alleyways. From the outside, everything appeared normal. But beneath, there was readiness. And that's the fascinating part. Derinkuyu represents collective planning across centuries. It required cooperation, labor, and long-term thinking. You don't carve 18 levels underground because you're optimistic about the geopolitical climate. You carve them because history has taught you a lesson. Empires rise, armies march, borders shift. And sometimes, the smartest response is not to fight, it's to vanish. Together. Not into myth, not into legend, but into stone corridors carved beneath your own front door. Now let's address the practical question no one likes to think about. How do 20,000 people quietly disappear? Because vanishing sounds dramatic and poetic until you realize it requires coordination. A lot of it. When word spread that danger was approaching, there had to be a system. You don't evacuate an entire town underground by casually strolling downward one at a time. There were likely signals, messengers, agreed-upon procedures. Perhaps lookouts stationed on higher ground, watching for dust clouds on the horizon. Once the decision was made, everything moved quickly. Food supplies were carried down, grain sacks, dried fruit, oil jars, water containers. Livestock herded carefully into upper-level chambers. Children kept close. Fires extinguished above ground to avoid attracting attention. And then entrances were sealed. From the outside, the town would appear abandoned. No smoke, no movement, no resistance. Just silence, which is psychologically unsettling for an invading force. You prepare for confrontation, and instead, you find emptiness. No plunder, no captives, no battle. Meanwhile, beneath your boots, thousands of people are breathing as quietly as possible. And that's the key word, quiet. Sound discipline would have mattered. Large gatherings had to remain controlled, cooking fires carefully managed, doors opened and closed without chaos. Imagine trying to keep 20,000 people calm in confined spaces. One panic ripple could spread fast. So leadership must have existed. Organizers, elders, religious figures. People who maintained order and reassured the community that waiting was safer than rushing back to the surface. There's also the question of duration. How long could they stay below? With proper food storage and secure wells, weeks were certainly possible. Maybe months in extreme cases. The ventilation system ensured breathable air. Animals provided milk and warmth. But the longer you stay underground, the heavier the uncertainty becomes. You don't know what's happening above. Is your home burned? Are invaders still there? Has the danger passed? Eventually, someone had to climb back up, slowly, carefully, listening at the entrance. If the world above was quiet, the stone doors would roll open again. And just like that, a town would reappear, as if it had never left, which might be the most unsettling tactic of all. At some point, the waiting had to end. You can only live in suspended reality for so long. Even with water, food, and careful ventilation, underground life was never meant to last forever. So imagine the moment. Days, maybe weeks, have passed. The air is still. The city hums quietly with cautious routine. Then word spreads through the corridors. It might be safe. One person volunteers to check, or perhaps a small group. They move upward through narrow staircases, past sealed stone doors, past sleeping chambers and storage rooms, climbing level after level toward the entrance. Each step carries uncertainty. Is the town destroyed? Are soldiers still camped outside? Has the danger truly passed? Or is this a trap? When they finally reach the uppermost passage, someone slowly shifts the massive circular door. Stone grinds against stone. The sound echoes through the tunnel. Then light. Actual sunlight. After days or weeks of oil lamps and shadows, the sky must have felt overwhelming. Too bright. Too open. Almost unreal. The scout steps outside, listens. No shouting, no marching boots, no smoke on the horizon, just wind. And maybe birds. The all-clear signal would travel downward quickly. Doors rolled back. Families gathered belongings. Animals herded upward. People emerging one by one into the open air like figures stepping out of another world. To an outsider watching from afar, it would have looked strange. A silent town suddenly filling with life. But to the residents, it was relief, and perhaps disbelief. Was everything intact? Homes still standing? Crops trampled? Livestock missing? They would rebuild what needed rebuilding, repair what had been damaged. And then, crucially, they would not abandon the underground city. They would maintain it, clean it, prepare it, because history had taught them something important. danger does not disappear permanently. It pauses. Derinkuyu wasn't a one-time solution. It was a recurring strategy. Each emergence back into sunlight was not the end of fear. It was simply the end of that particular threat. And beneath their feet, the stone city remained ready. Quiet. Waiting for the next time the horizon darkened. At this point, you might be wondering something very reasonable. Who actually built all of this? Because carving 18 levels underground is not a casual side hobby. You don't wake up on a Saturday and think, let's expand the apocalypse bunker a bit. Derinkuyu was carved into volcanic tuff, a soft rock formed from ancient eruptions. It's firm enough to hold its shape, but soft enough to cut with iron tools. That's the geological luck part. The human part is harder to explain. This project wasn't built in a single lifetime. It unfolded over centuries. The earliest phases may date back to the Phrygians around the 8th century BCE. Later civilizations, particularly Byzantine Christians, expanded and reinforced the complex. Each generation added something: a new corridor, a deeper chamber, an improved ventilation shaft, and that's what makes it remarkable. This wasn't panic digging, it was long-term planning. Someone, at some point, decided that going underground was not just a temporary reaction, it was an architectural philosophy, and future generations agreed enough to keep digging. Think about the coordination required: excavating narrow vertical shafts without modern safety equipment, removing tons of rock manually, carving symmetrical rooms that wouldn't collapse, designing airflow systems using nothing but observation and experience. There were no engineering textbooks, no structural modelling software, just trial, error, and the very strong motivation of not wanting to be conquered. It likely required organised labour, teams working level by level, skilled diggers, stone cutters, people responsible for shaping doorways and staircases, and it required trust. Because you don't invest that much labour into something unless you believe your descendants will use it. Derinkuyu represents generational fear, but also generational cooperation. One group begins the tunnel, the next improves it, the next fortifies it. By the time it reached its full scale, it wasn't just a shelter. It was inherited infrastructure, a legacy carved into stone. Most civilizations leave monuments above ground: temples, statues, palaces. Derinkuyu left its masterpiece hidden. No glory, no grand facade, just miles of tunnels that say very quietly, "We were prepared." And preparation, sometimes, is the most powerful architecture of all. For something capable of housing 20,000 people, Derinkuyu had an impressively quiet retirement. No dramatic collapse, no buried by volcano tragedy, no ancient curse guarding the entrance. It was simply forgotten. Over time, the threats that made underground living necessary began to fade. Empires shifted, borders stabilized, warfare patterns changed. The intense cycles of invasion that once swept through Cappadocia became less frequent. And when fear decreases, motivation follows. Why descend 60 meters into rock when the surface feels safe? Gradually, the underground city transitioned from emergency refuge to backup option, to rarely used fallback, to old infrastructure. Entrances were sealed, some collapsed naturally. Others were intentionally blocked to prevent accidents or unauthorized access. Knowledge of deeper levels likely survived as local memory for a while. Stories passed down, vague awareness of old tunnels beneath the town. But without repeated use, even the most impressive systems fade from daily life. New generations grow up playing in streets, farming fields, building homes, unaware that beneath their foundations lies a second city. And that's how it happens. History doesn't always vanish through catastrophe. Sometimes it disappears through comfort. There's also a psychological factor. Living underground is exhausting. It's stressful. It's reactive. Once stability returns, people want sunlight, open space, fresh air. They want permanence above ground. The underground becomes associated with fear. And fear, once gone, is something people prefer not to revisit. So Derinkuyu slept. For centuries, its corridors collected dust. Its ventilation shafts stood silent. Its stone doors rested in place, no longer rolled shut in urgency. Above it, life continued normally. Homes were built, basements added, renovations done. Generations lived and died, completely unaware that beneath them existed one of the largest subterranean cities ever created. Until 1963, until one man knocked down a wall. Which means for hundreds of years, one of humanity's most remarkable survival systems was hiding in plain sight. Not buried by disaster, but simply overshadowed by time. And that might be the strangest part of all. Something this massive didn't need to be destroyed to disappear. It just needed to be unnecessary. At this point, it's tempting to treat Derinkuyu as an architectural curiosity, an impressive relic, a very elaborate overreaction carved into volcanic rock. But it's more than that. Derinkuyu reveals something fundamental about human nature. When faced with repeated instability, people don't just defend, they adapt. Most civilizations build upward to show power. Towers, temples, walls visible from miles away. They signal dominance, confidence, control. Derinkuyu did the opposite. It built downward, quietly, invisible. There's humility in that choice. Not weakness, realism. The builders understood that sometimes you cannot win the battle. Sometimes the smarter move is to outlast it. That's not dramatic. It's strategic and deeply human. We like to imagine history as a series of heroic last stands and glorious victories. But survival often looks different. It looks like preparation, contingency planning, building a second world just in case the first one collapses. Derinkuyu wasn't built because people were optimistic. It was built because they were experienced. They had seen invasions before. They knew empires rise and fall. They understood that stability is fragile, so they created insurance. Stone insurance. It also shows how communities function under pressure. You don't build something like this alone. It requires cooperation, shared effort, trust across generations. The person carving a tunnel likely knew they might never personally need the deepest level, but someone in the future might. That's long-term thinking. And it's rare. Derinkuyu represents patience in architecture, fear transformed into structure, anxiety converted into engineering. And there's something almost poetic about that. Instead of letting fear paralyze them, they carved it into stone corridors that protected them. Instead of collapsing under uncertainty, they built redundancy. It's a reminder that resilience doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides beneath the surface, unseen, ready. Derinkuyu is not just about the past. It's a question. If your world became unstable tomorrow, what would you build? Higher walls? Or a deeper plan? Because the people of Derinkuyu chose depth. And depth, as it turns out, can be very powerful. By now, Derinkuyu feels less like an ancient curiosity and more like a mindset carved into stone. 20,000 people, 18 levels, ventilation systems, water security, defensive stone doors, all hidden beneath an ordinary town, and for centuries nobody knew. That's the part that lingers. This wasn't a monument meant to impress rivals. It wasn't built to showcase power or wealth. No grand facade, no towering columns, no inscriptions bragging about conquest. It was built for one purpose: to survive. Derinkuyu is quiet power, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that waits. And maybe that's why it feels so modern, because beneath our own cities today are tunnels, bunkers, contingency systems. We still build backups. We still prepare for instability, even if we hope we'll never need those plans. The people of Derinkuyu understood something timeless. The world above is not always stable. Empires change, borders shift, threats appear without invitation. So they built a second option. Not glamorous, not comfortable, but effective. And when danger passed, they didn't celebrate their underground genius with monuments or poetry. They just walked back into the sunlight and continued living. Calmly. That image says everything. Thousands of people emerging from the earth, blinking into daylight, resuming ordinary life as if disappearing underground for weeks was simply part of the routine. No drama, just preparedness. And then, when stability returned, they maintained the system. Just in case. That's discipline. That's patience. That's a community thinking beyond the present moment. Derinkuyu forces us to rethink what strength looks like. It's not always loud resistance. It's not always grand victories. Sometimes strength is quiet infrastructure. Sometimes it's having somewhere safe to go. And sometimes the most impressive thing a civilization can do is remain unseen until it's absolutely necessary. 20,000 people once vanished beneath the earth, and history barely noticed. But the stone remembers, and now, so do we. Before Rome conquered Gaul, paved roads across continents, or argued about philosophy in marble forums, it mastered something far more practical: how to turn milk into survival. Cheese was not a luxury in ancient Rome. It was infrastructure. It was military logistics. It was breakfast. Roman cheese began in the pasture, not the palace. Sheep and goats were everywhere across the Italian peninsula, grazing on rocky hills that weren't exactly ideal for wheat, but were perfect for milk production. Sheep's milk, thick and rich, became the backbone of early Roman cheesemaking. It spoiled quickly in Mediterranean heat, so Romans did what practical people always do: they preserved it. Enter cheese. The process was simple but effective. Fresh milk was warmed and mixed with rennet, often taken from the stomach lining of young animals. The milk separated into curds and whey. The curds were pressed, salted, sometimes smoked, and left to age. What started as fragile liquid became something durable, portable, dependable. In other words, very Roman. Cheese travelled well, which made it essential for soldiers. A legionary marching through rough terrain could not carry fresh milk. But a hardened wheel of salted cheese, that could survive weeks, maybe months. In an empire obsessed with expansion, food that didn't rot was basically a strategic advantage. It also crossed social lines. Farmers ate it, slaves ate it. Senators probably pretended to have refined preferences but still ate it. Cheese appeared in rural cottages and urban markets alike. It could be eaten fresh and soft, or aged and sharp. It could be grated over dishes, crumbled into bread, or simply sliced and eaten with olives. And here's the part most people overlook. Cheesemaking was documented. Roman agricultural writers treated it seriously. It wasn't random guesswork. It was methodical, precise, nearly scientific. They recorded measurements, techniques, seasonal adjustments. This wasn't just cooking, it was applied knowledge. So while we tend to associate Rome with triumphal arches and military campaigns, remember this: none of that happens on an empty stomach. The empire that ruled the Mediterranean was, in part, powered by curds pressed under stone and salted by careful hands. Not glamorous, not dramatic, but quietly essential. If Chapter 1 was about survival, Chapter 2 is about precision. Because Romans did not just stumble into good cheese, they wrote manuals about it, detailed ones. And leading that charge was a man named Columella, a first-century agricultural writer who treated cheesemaking with the seriousness of a military campaign. Columella did not describe cheese like a hobbyist sharing grandma's recipe. He broke it down step by step. Milk had to be fresh, not mostly fresh, not smells fine if you ignore it. Fresh. It had to be strained carefully, heated gently. Too much heat would ruin texture. Too little would prevent proper curd formation. Precision mattered. Then came rennet. He advised using it sparingly, emphasizing balance. Too much and the curds toughened. Too little and you were left with a sad, watery mess. Once the milk separated into curds and whey, timing again became everything. The curds had to be transferred into baskets or moulds, allowing whey to drain naturally. Gravity did its quiet work. Pressing followed. Stones were often placed on top to squeeze out remaining liquid. The goal was firmness without brutality. Roman cheese was not supposed to be crushed into oblivion. It was shaped, guided, controlled. Salt was the next crucial step. And not just for flavour. Salt preserved. It pulled moisture outward, creating an environment where spoilage bacteria struggled to thrive. In a world without refrigeration, salt was insurance. Columella even addressed seasonal variation. Milk quality changed throughout the year depending on what animals grazed on. Spring milk differed from late summer milk. Pasture conditions influenced taste. Roman farmers were expected to notice this. Adjust accordingly. Cheesemaking was not static. It responded to nature. What makes this remarkable is the mindset behind it. This was not mystical kitchen magic. It was agricultural engineering. The Romans approached food production the same way they approached aqueducts and roads, with structure and documentation. Nearly 2,000 years ago, they understood that consistency required control, and thanks to writers like Columella, their cheese-making knowledge did not vanish into rumour. It was recorded, preserved, passed down. Rome's power may have been built on legions and law, but its daily stability relied on careful hands, pressing curds under steady weight, following instructions written with surprising clarity for a world without thermometers or stainless steel. If you think Roman cheese was bland, think again. The empire that imported spices from distant shores was not about to leave its dairy tasting like wet parchment. Romans flavoured their cheese, sometimes subtly, sometimes boldly, and in doing so turned preservation into art. Let's start with salt. Not glamorous, not exciting, but absolutely essential. Salt was rubbed onto the surface of fresh wheels or mixed directly into curds. It pulled moisture out, tightened texture, and created a protective outer layer. In a hot Mediterranean climate, salt was the line between edible and regrettable. But Romans did not stop there. Herbs were common additions, especially in rural areas. Thyme, rosemary, and savoury could be mixed into curds before pressing. Imagine cutting into a wheel and catching that earthy scent. This was not decorative garnish, it was practical flavouring. Herbs grew easily across Italy's hillsides. Why not use them? Then came smoke. Smoking cheese served two purposes: preservation and complexity. Wheels were hung above hearth fires, where slow, steady smoke from olive wood or other local fuels curled upward and settled into the rind. The outer layer hardened. The interior absorbed subtle smoky tones. It also lasted longer. In a pre-refrigeration world, that mattered more than culinary trends. Some cheeses were eaten fresh, soft, moist, barely aged. Others were left to harden for months, even years. Aging intensified flavour. It created sharpness, bite, that slight crumble that feels intentional rather than accidental. And the Romans noticed regional differences. Cheese from mountain pastures tasted different from cheese made in coastal plains. Animals grazing on wild herbs produced milk with distinct character. The land flavoured the milk before the cheesemaker ever touched it. This is where things get interesting. Cheese became identity. A region's pasture, a shepherd's method, a smoking technique passed down through generations. Long before protected designation labels and food certifications, Romans understood that place-shaped flavour. So no, Roman cheese was not some uniform block stamped out of an imperial factory. It was local, varied, adaptable. And while Rome standardized law and currency across vast territories, its cheese remained wonderfully inconsistent, shaped by smoke, herbs, salt, and the quiet personality of the land itself. Rome did not build an empire by packing light salads. It built one by feeding marching men across mountains, forests, deserts, and lands that probably did not welcome them with open arms. And cheese, humble, solid, dependable cheese, was one of the quiet heroes of that expansion. A Roman legionary carried a ration that had to survive weeks of travel. Grain was essential, dried meat was valuable, but cheese was reliable. A hard, salted wheel could endure rough handling, fluctuating temperatures, and long storage without turning into something tragic. It required no elaborate preparation. Slice it, bite it, march on. This was not accidental. Roman military logistics were obsessively organized. Supplying thousands of soldiers across vast distances required food that was compact, calorie-dense, and resistant to spoilage. Cheese fit perfectly into that equation. It provided protein and fat, energy that lasted longer than a handful of figs. Imagine a column of soldiers moving along a newly constructed road, shields clanking, sandals grinding against stone. When they stopped to rest, bread and cheese likely appeared. Simple, functional, effective. Not glamorous, but armies are rarely fueled by glamour. Cheese also travelled across provinces as part of tax and tribute systems. Regions known for quality production could supply urban centres or garrisons. In this way, dairy linked rural landscapes to imperial power. Shepherds in distant hills indirectly supported campaigns hundreds of miles away. And here is where the story deepens. As legions moved, so did tastes. Soldiers stationed in Gaul, Hispania, or the eastern provinces encountered local cheese-making traditions. Techniques blended. Ideas spread. What began in Italian pastures evolved through contact with Celtic, Iberian, and Near Eastern methods. Cheese became cultural exchange disguised as lunch. Even in frontier forts, far from Rome's marble monuments, cheese remained familiar. It reminded soldiers of home, of farms and villages left behind. In a world defined by conquest and displacement, that small comfort mattered. So when we think of Roman expansion, we picture eagles, standards, and armoured ranks. But behind every victory stood supply lines, and somewhere within those supply wagons, wrapped in cloth or packed in crates, sat wheels of salted cheese, quiet, sturdy companions to empire. If cheese fueled the legions, it also fueled the city. And nowhere was that more obvious than in Rome itself, a metropolis of noise, sweat, ambition, and very strong smells. Among those smells, cheese, fresh, aged, soft, sharp, probably overwhelming by mid-morning. Urban markets were the heartbeat of daily life. Farmers and merchants arrived early, setting up stalls stacked with produce, bread, oil, and of course wheels of cheese in various sizes. Some small and fresh, wrapped in leaves. Others large and hardened, meant to be cut and sold by weight. This was not boutique food culture. This was volume. Rome was enormous by ancient standards. Feeding its population required steady supply chains from surrounding countryside and distant provinces. Cheese moved along roads and waterways just like grain and wine. Rural producers relied on urban demand. City dwellers relied on rural expertise. It was a partnership built on appetite. Prices varied depending on quality and origin. Fresh cheese was cheaper and more common. Aged varieties cost more. Imported cheeses, yes, imported, could carry prestige. Regional reputation mattered. Just as wine from certain provinces gained fame, so did certain dairy regions. And merchants were not passive middlemen. They understood presentation. A well-aged wheel with a firm rind signalled durability. A crumbly interior suggested depth of flavour. Even without modern marketing, visual cues mattered. Customers judged with their eyes before their taste buds. Cheese also appeared in taverns and inns. Grated over dishes, served alongside olives and bread, paired with diluted wine. It was accessible, flexible, adaptable to both humble meals and more refined settings. But here's the key. Cheese was not static once it entered the city. It could be reshaped, mixed into recipes, or cooked into sauces. Roman cuisine embraced texture. Melted cheese could thicken dishes or enrich stews. Hard cheese could be grated finely to add intensity without bulk. In this way, cheese became part of urban rhythm, bought in the morning, shared at midday, incorporated into evening meals. Rome's markets were chaotic, loud, and competitive. Yet within that chaos, cheese remained constant, stacked in wheels, sliced by hand, moving from pasture to plate with remarkable consistency. Not flashy, not ceremonial, just dependable nourishment in a city that never really slowed down. By the time cheese reached the Roman kitchen, its journey was far from over. It was not simply sliced and served, though that certainly happened. In Roman cooking, cheese could be grated, melted, whipped, baked, and sometimes transformed into dishes that would surprise modern expectations. Roman cuisine did not shy away from mixing flavors. Sweet and savory often coexisted without apology. Cheese played its part in this culinary confidence. Fresh cheeses were blended with herbs and olive oil into spreads. Hard cheeses were grated into sauces or scattered over vegetables to intensify flavor. In some recipes, cheese thickened mixtures in place of flour. We know this because Roman cookery was documented. Recipes attributed to Apicius include instructions that combine cheese with eggs, honey, pepper, and garum, that famous fermented fish sauce that Romans seemed to put on nearly everything. The result might sound chaotic to modern ears, but to Romans it was layered and balanced. Cheese also appeared in baked goods. Savoury pastries filled with soft curds, dishes resembling early cheesecakes made with fresh cheese, eggs, and honey. These were not towering desserts dripping with syrup. They were modest, compact, and rich, suitable for offerings, celebrations, or everyday indulgence. Even vegetables benefited. Cabbage, lentils, and greens could be enhanced with grated cheese, adding depth and saltiness. It was a practical way to elevate simple ingredients. When meat was scarce or expensive, cheese stepped in as a reliable source of protein and richness. What stands out most is flexibility. Cheese adapted to the dish, rather than dominating it. It could be subtle background support or sharp foreground intensity. It melted into sauces or held its shape when crumbled over warm bread. And unlike certain elite ingredients, cheese crossed social boundaries in the kitchen. A rural household might prepare a simple curd mixed with herbs. An urban cook in a wealthy home might craft a more elaborate baked dish. Different settings, same ingredient. In this sense, cheese was democratic. It belonged to farmers and senators alike. It could be humble or refined, rustic or structured. So while Rome's culinary reputation often focuses on wine, olives, and garum, cheese quietly wove itself through everyday meals, steady, adaptable, and always ready to improve whatever happened to be simmering over the fire. As Rome expanded, so did its cheese map. What began in the hills of central Italy quickly became a mosaic of regional styles stretching from Britannia to the Near East. And like wine, cheese carried the personality of the land it came from. Different provinces had different animals, pastures, and climates. Sheep grazing on dry Mediterranean herbs produced milk with one character. Cattle feeding in the lush fields of Gaul produced something entirely different. Goats in rocky uplands yielded milk with sharper tones. The Romans noticed these distinctions. They talked about them. They valued them. Certain regions became known for particular styles. Alpine areas produced firmer cheeses suited to aging in cooler mountain air. Coastal regions leaned toward fresher varieties. In Hispania and Gaul, dairy traditions blended local methods with Roman influence. Techniques merged. Salt levels shifted. Smoking practices evolved. This was not culinary chaos. It was adaptation. Rome did not erase local identity overnight. It absorbed it. And cheese became one of the clearest examples of that cultural blending. Roman agricultural methods spread outward, but provincial traditions flowed back inward. Markets in Rome might sell cheeses shaped by distant landscapes, each wheel carrying a subtle story of soil and grass. Transport infrastructure made this possible. Roads and shipping routes allowed durable cheeses to move across long distances. A well-aged wheel could travel by cart or ship without losing its integrity. In this way, regional flavour entered the imperial centre, and reputation mattered. a cheese known for sharpness or longevity could gain prestige. Merchants and buyers would recognize origin by texture, rind color, or taste. Even without printed labels, branding existed in memory and habit. There is something quietly powerful about that. An empire spanning continents still allowed for local dairy character to survive. Uniform law did not mean uniform flavor. In fact, diversity strengthened supply. If drought struck one region, another might compensate. If herds fluctuated in one province, others stepped in. Cheese production was decentralized but interconnected. So when we imagine Roman food culture, it should not look monochrome. It should look varied. Wheels of different sizes, colors, textures, each shaped by climate, animals, and human hands. Cheese in ancient Rome was not just nourishment. It was geography made edible. For all its regional pride and military importance, cheese ultimately lived where all food truly matters, at the table. And in ancient Rome, that table could look very different depending on who you were. In rural cottages, cheese was steady and familiar. A shepherd's family might eat fresh curds the same day they were made. Soft, slightly tangy, perhaps mixed with herbs. Bread, olives, and cheese formed a reliable trio. Not luxurious, not dramatic, just consistent. For urban labourers and slaves, cheese was practical fuel. It required no elaborate preparation. It could be carried to work. It provided strength without ceremony. In crowded insular apartment blocks, simple meals mattered more than spectacle. Cheese delivered calories and protein in a compact form. But step into the home of a wealthy Roman, and cheese did not disappear. It evolved. Elite households had access to aged varieties, imported wheels, and more complex preparations. Cheese might appear at the beginning of a meal as part of a spread with fruits and nuts. It might reappear incorporated into sauces or baked dishes. Even at banquets, where exotic meats and extravagant courses dominated, cheese maintained its place. And here's the interesting part. Unlike certain luxury foods reserved strictly for the elite, cheese crossed social boundaries easily. It did not belong exclusively to one class. It scaled up or down depending on context. Fresh cheese could be humble. Aged cheese could be prestigious. The same basic ingredient adapted itself to economic reality. There were even moments when cheese carried symbolic weight. Agricultural abundance was tied to stability. Healthy herds meant reliable milk. Reliable milk meant cheese. In that sense, cheese was an indicator of rural productivity. A shortage would not just affect taste, it would affect morale. In markets, social distinctions blurred. A senator and a labourer might buy from the same stall, though perhaps not the same wheel. One selected the finest aged wedge, the other chose a modest portion, but both recognised its value. Cheese was not flashy status theatre like imported spices or rare seafood. It was steadier, more grounded, and that might be its most Roman quality of all, adaptable, resilient, present in every layer of society without losing its identity. Empires fall, roads crack, marble statues lose their noses. But cheese survives. When the Western Roman Empire fractured in the 5th century, its infrastructure weakened, but many of its agricultural traditions endured. Cheesemaking did not disappear with the legions. It settled into monasteries, rural estates, and village farms. Techniques recorded by writers like Columella continued to echo quietly through the centuries. Monastic communities, in particular, became guardians of dairy knowledge. They refined aging techniques, standardized production methods, and preserved regional styles. Many European cheeses we recognize today evolved from practices rooted in Roman-era agriculture, salted curds, pressed wheels, controlled aging. The idea of hard, transportable cheese remained essential in medieval Europe. Just as Roman soldiers needed durable rations, so did travellers, pilgrims, and merchants. Salted wheels continued to cross mountains and rivers. The logic never changed. Preserve milk, extend its life, carry it far. Even flavouring traditions persisted. Herbs, smoke, aging caves, These methods feel timeless, because they are. They were practical solutions long before they became culinary signatures. What Rome contributed was structure, documentation, the mindset that food production could be analysed, improved, and replicated. Cheese-making was not random tradition. It was method, process, adjustment according to season and pasture. That approach laid groundwork for the dairy cultures of Europe. Today, when you encounter aged sheep's milk cheeses from Italy, Spain, or France, you are tasting layers of history. The specific recipes evolved, of course. Regions refined their own identities. But the foundation, separating curds from whey, salting, pressing, aging, would feel familiar to a Roman farmer. There is something quietly profound about that continuity. Across 2 millennia, through wars, plagues, and political collapse, the basic act of turning milk into cheese endured. Rome may be remembered for law codes, aqueducts, and conquest, but its daily life left another legacy, one you can still slice, grate, or crumble onto bread. In the end, cheese outlasted the empire that helped perfect it. Not dramatic, not monumental, just persistent, and perhaps that is the most Roman legacy of all. Before European merchants boasted of their grand bazaars, before crowded Renaissance squares claimed to be the centre of the world, the Market of Tlatelolco was already operating on a scale that would have stunned them. Up to 60,000 people gathered here daily. Not occasionally. Daily. At first light, the movement began across Lake Texcoco. Canoes cut through the still water, stacked high with goods from the surrounding chinampas. Floating agricultural fields that made the valley astonishingly productive. Farmers brought maize still wrapped in husks, beans in woven sacks, squash, tomatoes, and fiery chilies. The air carried the scent of damp earth and vegetation long before the plaza filled. As the sun rose higher, the square transformed into a carefully organised ecosystem. This was not a chaotic crowd shouting over one another. The market had structure. Vendors were grouped by category. Food sellers occupied one section, pottery and tools another. Textiles and garments had their own space. Precious goods, jade, gold, featherwork, were displayed separately. Officials walked among the crowds. Judges sat in designated areas to resolve disputes quickly and publicly. If someone tried to cheat, it did not go unnoticed. Order was part of the spectacle. The scale alone required discipline. Imagine the sound. Thousands of voices negotiating prices, porters moving goods on their backs, turkeys gobbling in wicker cages, the thud of baskets being set down, the rustle of woven mats spread out to display merchandise. It was not just commerce, it was rhythm. People did not come only to buy. They came to see, to exchange news, to observe the abundance of their empire laid out in one place. The market was proof of prosperity, proof that tribute flowed inward from distant regions, proof that the Mexico world was interconnected and thriving. Standing in the middle of Tlatelolco, you would not simply feel surrounded by goods, you would feel surrounded by power. Agriculture, trade networks, and social order converged here in visible form. This was not a side attraction to the capital. It was its heartbeat. Every morning it pulsed again, and the city moved with it. If the plaza was the heart, then food was the pulse you could taste in the air. Walk into the food section of the Market of Tlatelolco, and you were surrounded by colour. Maize in every shade, white, yellow, blue. Stacks of tortillas still warm from clay griddles. Tamales wrapped in corn husks, filled with beans, chilies, squash, or meat. Steam rising in soft clouds. Turkeys were tethered or kept in woven cages, their feathers ruffling as buyers inspected them. Dogs bred for food, small, hairless xoloids quintly, were also sold, not as pets, as protein. For a modern audience, that may sound surprising. For the Mexica, it was normal. Cacao beans were traded carefully, sometimes even counted individually. They were more than an ingredient. They were currency. A handful of beans could buy food. A larger pouch could secure cloth or tools. In the market, economics and appetite blended seamlessly. Amaranth cakes appeared in neat stacks. Dense, nutritious, sometimes mixed with honey. Chili sauces of every intensity sat in clay bowls. Green, red, dark brown, thick and thin, each vendor proudly claiming superiority. And then there were insects, grasshoppers, maguey worms, ant larvae, seasoned, toasted, sometimes ground into pastes, high in protein and widely consumed. To dismiss them would be to misunderstand the ingenuity of the food system. Nothing edible was wasted. The land provided variety, and the market displayed it unapologetically. Flowers were also sold for consumption, squash blossoms, fragrant and delicate, herbs bundled tightly, edible greens gathered from lake edges. The range was astonishing. Prepared food vendors added another layer of energy. You did not have to cook at home. You could eat right there. Stews simmered in clay pots. Drinks were poured into gourds. Buyers sat briefly on mats to eat before returning to the flow. What made it remarkable was scale and abundance. This was not scarcity-driven survival. This was a thriving food culture supported by advanced agriculture, tribute systems, and trade routes stretching across Mesoamerica. In one section of the plaza, you could taste the empire, and it tasted bold, smoky, spicy, sweet, earthy, alive with variety and confidence. If the food stalls showed you how people survived, the luxury sections of the Market of Tlatelolco showed you how the empire displayed its power. Beyond the scent of tamales and chili, you entered areas where goods gleamed rather than steamed. Feathers shimmered in impossible colours, deep turquoise, brilliant scarlet, iridescent green. These were not ordinary bird feathers. Many came from distant tropical regions, carried hundreds of miles through tribute networks. Feather workers transformed them into cloaks, headdresses, shields, and ceremonial pieces that signalled rank and prestige. Nearby, gold and jade rested on woven mats. Gold was admired for its beauty, though not valued as currency in the same way Europeans later obsessed over it. Jade, green and smooth, held deep symbolic meaning. Obsidian blades lay carefully arranged, sharp volcanic glass that could slice cleaner than many metal edges of the time. Cotton textiles were folded neatly in stacks. Fine cloaks signified status. The quality of fabric told a story about wealth and origin. In a society where clothing marked social rank clearly, the textile section was more than retail. It was hierarchy on display. Much of this abundance flowed into the market through tribute. Conquered regions across Mesoamerica sent goods regularly to the Mexica capital. Cacao from the south, feathers from tropical forests, stones from distant quarries, salt from coastal areas. The market was where this vast network became visible to ordinary citizens. Merchants known as Pochteca played a crucial role. These were not casual traders. They were organized, respected, and sometimes politically influential. They traveled long distances, negotiated deals, and brought exotic goods back to Tlatelolco. Their knowledge of foreign lands and routes made them valuable to the state. Walking through this section, you would sense something beyond commerce. You would sense reach. The market was not just local farmers exchanging goods. It was a hub connecting mountains, jungles, lakes, and deserts. Every jade bead, every bolt of cotton, every obsidian blade represented labour from another region. The plaza was a living map of an interconnected world. And standing in the centre of it all, you could feel how trade reinforced authority. The empire was not only sustained by force, it was sustained by flow. Goods moving inward, power radiating outward. With tens of thousands of people gathering daily, the Market of Tlatelolco could have dissolved into chaos. Instead, it operated with remarkable discipline. Structure was not optional. It was essential. The plaza was carefully divided into sections. Vendors did not simply choose random spots. Food sellers grouped together. Textile merchants occupied their own area. Potters, toolmakers, jewellers, and feather workers each had designated spaces. This organisation made navigation easier and reinforced professional identity. You knew where to go for obsidian blades. You knew where to find tamales. Officials patrolled the grounds. overseeing transactions. Judges sat in a specific section to hear complaints and resolve disputes immediately. If a seller cheated a buyer, or if a disagreement erupted over price or quality, the matter could be addressed on the spot. Justice was public, swift, visible. Standards mattered. Weights and measures were monitored. Quality was expected. A damaged cloak or spoiled food was not easily overlooked. Reputation in a marketplace of this size could determine survival. A dishonest vendor risked exclusion. The presence of order did not drain the market of energy. It amplified it. The noise of bargaining, the movement of porters carrying heavy loads, the rustle of woven mats, all of it unfolded within a system that kept the vast machine functioning. There was also social structure embedded in the space. Nobles could move through certain areas with authority. Commoners navigated their own routines. Merchants from distant regions brought unfamiliar goods and accents, adding layers of cultural interaction. Yet everyone operated within shared rules. This was governance in action. The market was not separate from political power. It was a reflection of it. A state capable of organizing tribute across vast territories was equally capable of organizing daily commerce at its center. Imagine standing on an elevated platform and looking down. Thousands of people moving in patterns that seemed spontaneous, yet were guided by invisible lines of authority and custom. It was controlled abundance. The market's size alone was impressive. But its discipline, that was extraordinary. In the middle of constant negotiation and exchange, order prevailed, and that order made prosperity possible. In the market of Tlatelolco, wealth did not jingle in pockets. It rustled in pouches. Unlike many Old World societies, the Mexica did not rely on minted metal coins for everyday exchange. Instead, value moved through objects, practical, portable, widely accepted objects. Chief among them were cacao beans. Small, lightweight, and easy to count, cacao beans functioned as a medium of exchange for common transactions. A few beans could buy a tamale. A larger bundle might secure a rabbit, a cloak, or a tool. Because cacao was also used to make chocolate beverages reserved for elites and rituals, it carried both economic and cultural weight. But cacao was not the only form of currency. Cotton cloaks served as higher value units in larger transactions. Their quality, size, and weave signaled worth. In a world where textiles were labor-intensive and essential, cloth was stable value. Barter also played a role. Goods were exchanged directly when convenient. A farmer might trade maize for pottery. A fisherman might exchange dried fish for chili peppers. But even barter often referenced understood standards of value, the equivalent of so many cacao beans or a certain quality of cloth. This system required trust and shared understanding. Value was not stamped onto metal. It was agreed upon collectively. The market's officials helped maintain fairness, but the true stability came from tradition and reputation. There were even instances of counterfeit cacao beans, empty shells filled with dirt or other materials. That tells you something important. Whenever value exists, someone attempts to manipulate it. Market oversight helped curb such practices. But the fact that it happened at all shows how integrated cacao had become in daily life. What makes this remarkable is efficiency. In a marketplace of this size, with tens of thousands of participants, transactions flowed continuously without coinage in the European sense. The system worked. Walking through the plaza, you would see hands exchanging beans, cloaks folded and passed across mats, goods weighed against understood standards. It was fluid, practical, and rooted in the realities of the environment. Money here was edible, wearable, tangible. And yet, despite lacking metal coins, the market functioned with complexity that rivaled many contemporary cities across the ocean. Behind the endless movement of goods in the market of Tlatelolco stood a class of people who made it all possible. The Pochteca. These were not ordinary vendors selling what they grew in nearby fields. They were long-distance merchants, professionals of risk and negotiation. The Pochteca travelled far beyond the capital. They crossed mountains, forests, and rival territories, carrying textiles, obsidian, cacao, and finely crafted goods outward, and returning with exotic materials the valley itself could not produce. Bright quetzal feathers from tropical jungles, rare stones, coastal shells, regional delicacies, everything that made the market feel global within a single square. Travel in Mesoamerica was not leisurely. Roads could be long and dangerous. Merchant caravans had to move carefully, sometimes guarded, sometimes blending quietly into foreign cities. In certain cases, the Pochteca also served as informal intelligence gatherers. Observing political tensions, noting military strengths, reporting back to the Mexica leadership. This dual role elevated them socially. They were not nobles by birth, but they held influence and respect. Successful merchants could accumulate wealth and status. Some even sponsored rituals or feasts to display their prosperity. Commerce in this world was not just economic, it was political. Back in Tlatelolco, their stalls often displayed goods unfamiliar to the average citizen, items that had travelled hundreds of miles before being placed carefully on woven mats. Buyers were not only purchasing an object, they were purchasing distance, rarity, and connection. The presence of these merchants also reinforced the empire's reach. Tribute from conquered regions flowed regularly, but voluntary trade through Pochteca networks expanded diversity further. It allowed the market to offer not just what was demanded by rulers, but what was desired by consumers. Imagine the conversations in that section of the plaza. Stories of distant landscapes, rivers and coasts most had never seen. Rumours of conflicts, news from other cities. The market was not only a place of goods, it was a place of information. In that sense, the Pochteca were bridges. They linked faraway worlds to the centre of the Mexica universe, and every day, in the crowded market, those connections became visible. By midday, the Market of Tlatelolco was more than commerce, it was performance. This was where farmers from the Chinampas stood shoulder to shoulder with long-distance merchants, where nobles passed through to inspect tribute goods, where commoners compared prices, argued, laughed, and gossiped. The plaza was not just a place to buy necessities. It was a stage where society revealed itself. Clothing alone told stories. Fine cotton cloaks marked higher status. Simpler maguey fibre garments signalled more modest means. Jewellery, hairstyles, and the way someone carried themselves mattered. In a space this crowded, identity was visible. Families came together. Children watched transactions unfold, learning early how negotiation worked. Porters wove through the crowd with heavy loads strapped to their backs. Elderly vendors sat patiently behind their goods, calling out to passing buyers. And then there was the sound, the constant hum of bargaining, the rhythm of voices rising and falling, laughter from prepared food stalls, the squawk of birds, the shuffle of sandals against packed earth. It was not chaotic noise, it was layered texture. The market also functioned as a communication hub. News spread quickly here. Victories in distant campaigns, tribute arrivals, ritual announcements, political shifts. In a world without printing presses, the market was a living broadcast system. Religious and cultural life intertwined with trade. Certain goods were intended for ceremonies, flowers purchased for offerings, cacao reserved for ritual drinks. The line between economic and sacred was thin. Even disputes became part of the spectacle. When judges ruled on disagreements, people observed. Justice was visible and immediate. Authority reinforced itself through public process. If you wanted to understand the Mexico world, you did not need to stand inside a temple. You could stand in this plaza. You would see agriculture, hierarchy, craftsmanship, law, and belief woven together in one space. The market was not just a convenience, it was a mirror. It reflected the complexity, ambition, and structure of the society that built it. Every day, tens of thousands gathered, not just to trade goods, but to participate in the living drama of their empire. For years, the Market of Tlatelolco pulsed with confidence. Goods flowed in from across Mesoamerica. Tribute reinforced abundance. Order held firm. The plaza felt permanent, like the lake and mountains themselves. And then the strangers arrived. When Hernán Cortés and his men entered the Mexica capital in the early 16th century, they were taken to see the market. Spanish accounts describe their astonishment. They had seen markets in Europe, but nothing on this scale. The organization, the variety, the sheer number of people. It rivaled or surpassed the largest cities they knew. They observed the food sections, turkeys, cacao, fruits, insects. They noticed the careful grouping of goods. They commented on the judges maintaining order. Even as invaders, they could not ignore the sophistication before them. But admiration did not prevent violence. Tensions escalated in the city. Political alliances shifted. Distrust grew. The market, once a symbol of prosperity, stood at the center of a storm it did not create. Eventually, during the brutal conflict between the Spanish and Mexican forces, Tlatelolco became a battlefield. The plaza that once echoed with bargaining voices filled with chaos of a different kind. Trade stopped. Canoes no longer glided peacefully toward the docks. The system that had sustained tens of thousands daily fractured under siege and disease. Smallpox, brought unintentionally by Europeans, tore through the population. Infrastructure collapsed. The intricate network of tribute and commerce could not survive the combined force of warfare and epidemic. The fall of Tlatelolco was not just a military defeat, it was an economic rupture. A marketplace that had once demonstrated the strength of an empire now bore witness to its destruction. And yet, even in Spanish records written from a conqueror's perspective, there is a thread of respect for what they saw. The scale could not be dismissed. In its final days as an independent Mexican market, Tlatelolco represented both achievement and vulnerability. Proof that even the most organized, abundant systems can be undone by forces beyond their design. The heartbeat faltered, and the plaza fell silent in a way it never had before. After the fall, the noise did not immediately return. The once thriving Market of Tlatelolco, that daily convergence of 60,000 lives, became something else under colonial rule. The plaza remained, but the world that had animated it was fundamentally altered. Spanish authorities rebuilt and reshaped the area. Churches rose where temples had stood. Colonial markets emerged, but they operated under new economic logic. Metal coinage entered circulation. Tribute systems shifted to serve a different crown. Trade continued, but the rhythm had changed. Yet the memory of the great market never fully disappeared. Chroniclers described its scale with awe. Archaeologists, centuries later, uncovered layers of stone, tools, and artifacts that testified to its complexity. Beneath colonial architecture lay the bones of a commercial system that once rivaled any in the world. What strikes historians most is not simply its size, but its sophistication. Organized vendor districts, public judges, standardized value systems using cacao and textiles, long-distance merchant networks, agricultural innovation through chinampas. This was not an improvised gathering of stalls. It was structured urban commerce at a scale many contemporary European cities had not yet achieved. Modern Mexico City now surrounds the site. Traffic hums where canoes once docked. Buildings stand where woven mats once displayed amaranth cakes and obsidian blades. But the legacy lingers, the idea of the marketplace as social center, as political stage, as economic engine, that endured. Open-air markets across Mexico today still carry echoes of Tlatelolco's organization and vibrancy. The colors, the layered voices, the mingling of food, craft, and daily life. Standing in the modern Plaza de las Tres Culturas, where Aztec ruins, colonial church, and modern structures coexist, you feel time stacked vertically. Indigenous, colonial, modern, all occupying the same ground. The Market of Tlatelolco was not just large, it was a statement. It demonstrated how interconnected and prosperous the Mexico world had become before European contact. Empires rise and fall, markets burn and rebuild, but the memory of abundance, order and daily life lived at massive scale remains. And if you listen closely beneath the noise of the modern city, you can almost hear it again. Bargaining voices carried on the wind, echoing from a plaza that once fed an empire. Long before clothing became a statement of style, it was a matter of survival. Early humans wrapped themselves in animal hides not to impress anyone, but to endure cold nights, harsh winds, and relentless sun. Fabric was protection first, identity second. As agriculture emerged and societies stabilized, clothing evolved alongside civilization itself. In river valleys where farming flourished, new materials replaced hides. In ancient Egypt, linen became dominant. Along the banks of the Nile, flax plants were cultivated, harvested, and spun into fine thread. The result was lightweight, breathable cloth, ideal for scorching desert heat. Men commonly wore simple linen kilts, pleated carefully. Women wore longer sheath dresses, fitted and often secured with straps. The fabric was pale, reflecting sunlight. But simplicity did not mean uniformity. Quality varied dramatically. The finer the weave, the higher the status. Clothing already signalled rank. Priests shaved their bodies and wore purified linen for ritual cleanliness. Nobles displayed pleats and elaborate finishing. Labourers wore coarser cloth, practical and unadorned. Climate shaped material, but hierarchy shaped detail. Across the world, similar patterns unfolded. In Mesopotamia, wool dominated due to abundant sheep herding. Thick woven garments suited cooler winters and fluctuating temperatures. In hotter regions, lighter weaves prevailed. Clothing had become more than skin covering. It was an adaptation to geography. Yet even at this early stage, decoration emerged. Simple belts, jewellery layered over cloth. Dye techniques began to appear. Humans were not content with mere protection. They wanted distinction. The evolution of ancient clothing did not begin in royal courts. It began in fields, along riverbanks, and in workshops where fibres were twisted patiently by hand. It was slow, labour-intensive, dependent on environment. But from these humble origins, a powerful idea formed. What you wear tells the world who you are, where you live, what you do, and how high you stand in the social order. And that idea would only grow stronger as civilizations expanded. Before silk shimmered in royal courts or dyed robes signalled power, clothing was brutally simple: survive or suffer. Early humans did not wake up wondering what matched their sandals. They asked a far more urgent question: how do I not freeze tonight? In Ice Age landscapes and harsh steppes, animal hides were stitched together with bone needles and sinew thread. Fur faced inward for warmth. Leather faced outward to block wind and moisture. These garments were heavy, imperfect, and essential. Clothing was technology long before it was art. As climates stabilized and agriculture reshaped human life, something changed. Permanent settlements meant new materials could be cultivated intentionally. Plants could be grown not just for food, but for fiber. The leap from hide to woven cloth marked a turning point in human identity. In the fertile lands along the Nile, flax thrived. The people of ancient Egypt mastered the art of turning flax into linen, a lightweight, breathable fabric perfectly suited to desert heat. Linen reflected sunlight and allowed airflow, making it ideal for survival under a blazing sky. Men commonly wore linen kilts, wrapped tightly at the waist. Women wore long sheath dresses, simple in cut, but elegant in silhouette. But do not mistake simplicity for uniformity. The weave itself carried meaning. Fine linen, nearly translucent, required immense labour and skill. Only elites could afford it. Coarse linen signalled modest means. Across Mesopotamia, where sheep herding flourished, wool dominated. Thick woven garments provided insulation during cooler seasons. In colder upland regions, layered clothing developed naturally. Geography dictated material. Climate dictated function. And yet, even in these early societies, clothing began to communicate more than comfort. Priests in Egypt wore purified linen during rituals. Officials and nobles adorned themselves with pleats, sashes, and decorative elements. Jewelry layered over fabric amplified status. What began as protection slowly evolved into proclamation. The shift was subtle but profound. Clothing no longer just shielded the body from nature. It signaled rank, occupation, purity, and belonging. Fabric became language. And as civilizations grew more complex, that language would become richer, dyed in rare colors, embroidered with symbols, and guarded by laws that dictated who could wear what. But at its core, it all began with survival. Without climate pressure, there would have been no innovation. Without necessity, no identity stitched into cloth. Once clothing moved beyond survival, it quickly became something far more dangerous. It became power. And nowhere is that clearer than in the obsession with colour. In the ancient Mediterranean world, dye was status. Most fabrics began in natural shades, off-white linen, brown wool. To change that colour required labour, skill, and rare materials. And the rarer the dye, the higher the rank. One colour rose above all others: purple. In cities like Tyre, Phoenician craftsmen extracted dye from thousands of murex sea snails to produce a deep, rich purple known today as Tyrian purple. The process was grueling. The smell was unbearable. The yield was tiny. But the result was stunning. A colour that did not fade easily and shimmered in sunlight. Because it was so difficult to produce, purple became restricted. In ancient Rome, laws dictated who could wear it. Senators were allowed a purple stripe on their tunics. Emperors eventually reserved full purple garments for themselves. Wearing the wrong shade could signal rebellion or ambition. Clothing had become political. It was no longer just about warmth or modesty. It was about authority. A glance at someone's garment told you their place in the hierarchy. Rank was stitched into fabric. You did not need an introduction. Elsewhere, colour carried different meanings. In ancient China, certain hues were associated with elements and cosmic order. In Mesoamerica, bright textiles symbolized lineage and community identity. Across civilizations, dye became symbolic language. But dye was not the only signal. Patterns and embroidery carried meaning too. Borders indicated class. Specific motifs referenced gods, dynasties, or regional identity. Fabric became a canvas, and here is the fascinating shift. Clothing was now regulated. Sumptuary laws appeared in multiple societies, controlling what different classes could wear. The ruling elite understood something crucial. If everyone dressed the same, hierarchy blurred. Clothing maintained visual order. By the time ancient empires matured, fabric was no longer neutral. It was coded, charged, sometimes dangerous. A garment could declare loyalty. It could provoke envy. It could elevate or humiliate. Clothing had evolved from survival tool to social weapon, and civilizations would never again treat fabric as something ordinary. If purple dye represented power in the Mediterranean, silk represented something even greater in the East: mystery. In ancient China, silk production became one of the most closely guarded secrets in the world. According to tradition, the discovery of silk is credited to Lei Zhu, who supposedly observed a silkworm cocoon unravelling into fine thread. Whether legend or not, what followed was revolutionary. Silk was unlike anything else. Smooth, lightweight, strong. It shimmered in ways linen and wool could not. The process of raising silkworms, feeding them mulberry leaves, harvesting cocoons, and carefully unwinding the filament required patience and control. Entire regions specialized in it. Under the Han dynasty, silk became more than clothing. It was currency, diplomacy, and soft power. Officials were paid in bolts of silk. Foreign envoys received silk as gifts. It travelled westward along trade routes that would later be known collectively as the Silk Road. And as it moved, it transformed wardrobes far beyond China. In Persia, silk was woven into elaborate garments. In Rome, imported silk became a luxury obsession. Roman elites draped themselves in translucent silk robes, sometimes to the horror of traditionalists who saw the fabric as too revealing, too foreign, too indulgent. Silk blurred boundaries. It carried Chinese craftsmanship into Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Along the way, techniques blended, patterns merged. Silk weaving evolved in multiple cultures, each adapting the material to local aesthetics. But silk also symbolized control. In China, certain colors and designs were restricted to the imperial family. Dragons embroidered onto robes marked authority. The fabric was not merely beautiful, it reinforced cosmic order and political hierarchy. Silk was light, but its meaning was heavy. Its journey also reshaped global trade. Routes expanded not just for spices and metals, but for textiles. Merchants risked deserts and mountain passes to transport bolts of shimmering cloth. Clothing, once shaped purely by climate, now reflected global connection. A Roman senator could wear a garment spun in East Asia. A Persian noble could display patterns influenced by distant dynasties. Fabric had become a bridge across continents. And with silk, ancient clothing reached a new stage, no longer confined by geography, but carried across empires by ambition and desire. While silk shimmered across trade routes and purple dye marked imperial ambition, in the heart of the Mediterranean, another fabric quietly defined citizenship itself: wool. In ancient Rome, wool was everywhere. Sheep thrived across Italy and its provinces, and wool was practical, warm, and versatile. But what truly defined Roman clothing was not just the material, it was the way it was worn. Enter the toga. The toga was not stitched like a modern shirt. It was a massive semicircular piece of wool, carefully draped around the body in a specific, structured way. It required practice to wear correctly. It required time to arrange. And it was deliberately impractical. That was the point. Only Roman male citizens were permitted to wear the toga. Slaves could not. Foreigners could not. The toga declared status immediately. You were not just dressed. You were Roman. There were variations. The toga virilis marked adulthood. The toga praetexta, with its purple border, was reserved for magistrates and certain officials. The toga candida, whitened with chalk, was worn by political candidates, hence the word candidate. Clothing was campaign branding long before modern posters, and then there were women's garments. Roman women typically wore the stola, a long layered dress signifying respectability and marital status. Just as with men, fabric and detail mattered. Jewelry enhanced status. Hairstyles complemented clothing as visual markers of class. The draping itself communicated discipline. The toga was not designed for manual labor. It restricted movement. It demanded composure. A man in a toga was not expected to work in the fields. He was expected to debate, govern, or preside. In this way, clothing reinforced social roles. Fabric dictated posture. Draping dictated behavior. Unlike tailored garments of later centuries, ancient Mediterranean clothing relied heavily on wrapping and folding. Pins and belts secured cloth, but the structure came from the body's interaction with fabric. The toga eventually faded from daily use because it was cumbersome, but its symbolic power endured. For centuries, it remained the visual shorthand for Roman authority. In Rome, wool was not just warmth, it was citizenship stitched into cloth, heavy, deliberate, unmistakable. While Mediterranean elites perfected the art of draping fabric in elegant folds, beyond their borders a very different innovation was taking shape. One born not in marble forums, but on horseback. In the wide grasslands of Central Asia, mobility was survival. Nomadic groups such as the Scythians and later steppe cultures lived in the saddle. Riding for hours demanded practical clothing. Flowing robes and loose drapes simply would not do. And so, trousers emerged. For Mediterranean civilizations, trousers initially seemed strange, even barbaric. Greeks and Romans associated them with outsiders. Yet the logic was undeniable. Trousers protected legs from cold winds. They reduced chafing during long rides. They allowed freedom of movement without tangling fabric. In colder regions of Eurasia, layered wool and fur-lined garments became essential. Tunics were belted tightly. Boots rose high to protect against snow and mud. Clothing adapted directly to climate and lifestyle. The Persian Empire adopted trousers and long-sleeved tunics as standard attire. In Achaemenid Empire reliefs, figures are depicted in tailored garments that allowed both dignity and mobility. Unlike the toga, which symbolized stillness and civic life, trousers symbolized motion. Eventually, practicality won over prejudice. As Rome expanded northward into colder provinces like Gaul and Germania, soldiers began adopting trousers for warmth and efficiency. The military, more concerned with survival than fashion ideology, embraced what worked. This was a turning point in the evolution of clothing. Garments shifted from purely draped forms toward stitched, fitted shapes. Sewing techniques advanced. Tailoring became more precise. Climate continued to dictate design. In desert regions, loose robes protected against sun while allowing airflow. In mountainous areas, layered wool insulated against freezing temperatures. In tropical zones, lighter woven fibers prevailed. Clothing became a dialogue between environment and identity. What once defined civilized versus barbarian began to blur as empires absorbed foreign practices. The trousers that Romans once mocked eventually became commonplace across Europe. This chapter of clothing evolution reveals something powerful. Practicality often reshapes tradition. Fabric may symbolize culture, but function challenges pride. From horse-riding nomads to imperial armies, the stitched leg covering marked a subtle revolution, one that transformed how humans moved, fought, and survived in diverse climates. As clothing evolved across climates and empires, another layer deepened its meaning: the sacred. Fabric was no longer just protection or politics, it became spiritual language. In many early civilizations, what you wore could determine how close you stood to the divine. In ancient Egypt, priests wore carefully purified linen garments during rituals. Linen, light and clean, symbolized order and purity. The act of shaving body hair and dressing in simple white cloth was not aesthetic. It was ceremonial preparation. Clothing separated the sacred from the ordinary. Similarly, in Mesopotamia, temple garments signaled status within religious hierarchies. Certain robes, fringes, or head coverings marked priestly roles. The fabric itself might not have been extravagant, but the design carried authority granted by the gods. In ancient Israelite tradition, high priests wore elaborately constructed garments described in sacred texts. Layered tunics, breastplates adorned with precious stones, woven sashes. Each detail had symbolic meaning. Colors were not random. Materials were deliberate. In South Asia, early Vedic traditions placed ritual importance on cloth wrapping and purity. The way fabric was draped, the condition of the garment, and even the direction of wrapping could hold spiritual significance. And in ancient China, clothing aligned with cosmic philosophy. During certain dynasties, color corresponded to elements and dynastic legitimacy. The emperor's robes were not just regal, they symbolized harmony between heaven and earth. Sacred clothing often followed strict rules: who could wear it, when it could be worn, how it was prepared. Violation of these codes could be seen as sacrilege. Even burial garments reflected belief systems. The dead were dressed carefully for the afterlife. In some cultures, elaborate wrappings prepared the body for spiritual journeys. In others, special textiles signaled continuity beyond death. Clothing, at this stage, was no longer merely social. It mediated between human and divine. This evolution reveals something profound. Fabric became symbolic skin. It represented purity, devotion, authority granted by higher powers. Across continents, threads carried theology. And as ancient societies grew more complex, clothing's role in ritual life strengthened. The garment you wore could place you within cosmic order, or exclude you from it entirely. In sacred spaces, fabric was never just fabric. It was belief made visible. By the time ancient civilizations matured, clothing had become more than survival, status, or spirituality. It was identity. And one of the clearest ways societies expressed identity was through gender. Across early cultures, garments were rarely random. They were coded. In ancient Greece, men and women both wore draped garments, yet subtle differences signaled role and expectation. Men typically wore the chiton, often shorter for ease of movement, especially in athletic or military settings. Women wore longer versions, sometimes layered, emphasizing modesty and domestic virtue. Length mattered, fit mattered, accessories mattered. In ancient Rome, as mentioned earlier, the toga belonged to male citizens. Women wore the stola, which signified marital respectability. A woman caught in adultery could legally lose the right to wear it. Clothing enforced morality. In ancient China, layered robes differed not just by status, but by gendered cut and decoration. Sleeves, collars, and fastening styles communicated social role. In some dynasties, specific hairstyles paired with garments reinforced these distinctions. But climate and function still influenced design. In nomadic societies, both men and women often wore trousers for riding. In some Mesoamerican cultures, garments differed less dramatically between genders, but were distinguished by weaving patterns and adornment. Jewelry, belts, headdresses, all amplified identity. A warrior's armor signaled readiness for combat. A bride's garments marked transition. A child's clothing changed at specific life stages. Clothing also reflected labor division. Farmers wore garments suited to work. Elites wore garments that signaled exemption from manual labor. In some societies, women's clothing restricted movement intentionally, reinforcing domestic roles. Yet history also shows moments of fluidity. In certain ritual contexts, garments could invert expectations. Priests or performers might wear clothing associated with another gender to symbolize transformation or divine embodiment. Clothing was not just fabric stitched together. It was narrative stitched onto the body. As civilizations codified laws and customs, dress became regulated. What you wore declared who you were, who you belonged to, and what was expected of you. The evolution of ancient clothing reveals something constant. Humans use fabric to define themselves. Long before written biographies, garments told your story at a glance. Identity, quite literally, was worn on the surface. Behind every ancient garment stood invisible labour. Hands that spun fibre, dyed thread, and wove fabric long before it ever touched a body. The evolution of clothing was not just cultural, it was technological. Early weaving began on simple looms. Vertical warp-weighted looms were common across parts of Europe and the Mediterranean. Weighted threads hung downward while horizontal threads were passed back and forth. The process was slow. Producing a single bolt of cloth could take weeks. In places like ancient Egypt, linen production became highly refined. Flax fibers were soaked, beaten, combed, and spun into thread so fine that some surviving examples are nearly translucent. This required precision and experience. It was not casual household work. It was skilled craftsmanship. In Mesopotamia, wool production expanded with sheep domestication. Spinning and weaving became central economic activities. Textile workshops employed large numbers of workers. Cloth was taxed, traded, and recorded in administrative tablets. Then came innovation. The introduction of more advanced looms allowed for tighter weaves and patterned textiles. Dyeing techniques improved, enabling brighter and more durable colours. Mordants, substances that helped fix dye to fibre, enhanced longevity. Patterns moved beyond simple stripes into intricate geometric or symbolic designs. In China, silk weaving reached extraordinary complexity. Loom technology advanced to produce detailed brocades with layered designs. Fabric itself became art. Textile production also became a gendered domain in many societies. Women were often responsible for spinning and weaving within households, though large-scale workshops employed both men and women. The rhythmic turning of the spindle was a daily sound in ancient homes. Cloth was valuable because it required time. Fibre had to be grown or gathered. It had to be processed. Thread had to be spun evenly. Fabric had to be woven without error. Every stage required labour. This is why clothing was often repaired rather than discarded. Patches were common. Garments were altered and reused. Fabric was not disposable. The evolution of clothing is inseparable from the evolution of tools. As looms improved, so did complexity. As dye chemistry advanced, so did visual identity. What we often see as fashion was built on engineering. Threads, pulled carefully across wooden frames, changed how humans dressed. And in doing so, changed how they expressed culture, status, and survival. By the time ancient civilizations reached their height, clothing had become far more than protection from heat or cold. It had become structure, woven into law, economy, belief, and identity. Across the ancient world, from ancient Egypt to ancient China, garments revealed rank instantly. A fine linen kilt, a silk robe embroidered with dragons, a toga edged in purple. These were not merely outfits. They were declarations. Clothing stabilized hierarchy. It made social order visible. Sumptuary laws appeared in multiple civilizations, restricting who could wear certain colors, fabrics, or ornaments. These rules were not about taste. They were about control. If clothing blurred distinctions between classes, authority weakened. Fabric became governance made visible. Climate continued shaping design. Desert cultures favored breathable layers. Mountain societies layered wool and fur. Tropical regions developed lighter woven fibers. The human body adapted through cloth to every extreme environment. Trade networks spread textiles across continents. Silk moved westward. Wool and dyes moved east. Patterns blended. Techniques evolved. What began as localized solutions to climate turned into global exchange systems. Clothing also preserved memory. Burial garments reflected belief in the afterlife. Royal robes became heirlooms. Textile patterns carried tribal or dynastic symbolism. Fabric became history you could touch. And yet, beneath all the symbolism and power, the foundation remained the same. Thread twisted by hand. Looms creaking as fibers crossed. Dyes stirred in clay vessels. Labour stitched into every seam. The evolution of ancient clothing mirrors the evolution of civilization itself. It begins in necessity, survival against nature. It grows into expression, identity within community. It matures into structure, law, rank, ritual, and eventually it becomes art. What humans wore shaped how they moved, how they saw one another, and how they understood their place in the world. Even today, modern fashion still carries echoes of those ancient decisions. Draped silhouettes from Greece, tailored trousers born on the steppe, silk refined in China, linen perfected along the Nile. Clothing is never just fabric. It is adaptation, ambition, belief, and belonging woven together. And long before written constitutions or printed symbols, civilizations declared themselves through what they chose to wear.